Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Princeton University Press Ideas Podcast, a joint production of Princeton University Press and the New Books Network. I'm Mark Columbus, and today I'm speaking with Anthony Abraham Jack, author of the book Class Dismissed: When Colleges Ignore Inequality and Students Pay the Price. Tony, welcome to the New Books Network.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for agreeing to be on our show. I was wondering if you could start us off by telling our listeners something about yourself.
Yeah, I love that question because I get to talk about two things that are both central to who I am, but then also to my work. I'm a Head Start kid. I got my start through a program that was held in a multicolored classroom because we qualified for the program. And that program also is the reason why I went to Coconut Grove Elementary as compared to Francis S. Tucker, because my neighborhood was divided by McDonald Street. If you live on one side versus the other, it depends on what school you went to. And I'll tell you the history of America, depending on what side you lived on, whether you had resources for your school to take field trips, whether you had resources for your school for books and stuff. That's only gotten worse over time. And that program allowed me to go to the Better Resource School with the support of that principal, Dr. Don Beebe, and the rest was history. And the other part of who I am is I'm a first-year college student. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. My mom was a security guard at a school she helped to desegregate. And my brother is actually the janitor of my old elementary school, as well as being a lead supervisor at the local hospital. And so those are two things that are important to me because they shape so much about my own educational journey, but it also makes me keenly aware of the class inequalities that come to college when universities diversify along socioeconomic lines.
It's a very insightful book that you've written about this subject, especially, and it's very much a book of the present in terms of how you're engaging with the immediate crises that we've seen in American life. What led you to write a book about this moment?
Because to be honest with you, as much as it was about the moment, it was about everything that preceded it. As I say, and I hope anyone who picks up the book, I hope you come away with the fact that this is as much about the inequalities that COVID exacerbated than COVID itself. And the reason why I say that is because students were dealing with so many of the issues that I discussed in the book, but they were doing so silently and invisibly. COVID exacerbated the very inequalities that universities were ignoring. And I wanted to hold universities' feet to the fire and say, you need to stop. And if you are going to admit a diverse class, as I say in all of my work, you have to preemptively take steps to support a diverse class. You can no longer take this, admit, wait, and see approach to access and inclusion. You have to think critically before students get on campus. What is it about these new groups of students, these new zip codes that we are recruiting from, these new families that we are bringing to campus? What do we need to do to actually support them? That is what this book is about. And so I took this moment to opportunity to investigate that.
That is something that I thought was really interesting, was the idea that it seems sometimes there's this presumption that once the student gets past the gates, once they've been accepted, that things will happen a lot more smoothly. And yet, as you described, it's a lot more complex. That in many ways, it's just the beginning. And that it's something that is that colleges and universities oftentimes take pride in saying that they're doing these things, but as you explained, that not always adequate, especially at the most elite universities, which are your focus in the book.
Yes, one thing that's the book that I really wanted to do is this. I want us to get rid of the metaphor of the college bubble. It was never truly true, right? And definitely not the same level of veracity in that kind of like protective sphere that everything that happens inside is kind of like equal and almost utopian. I think we need to retire that, because when you think about what comes to college with students, right, and the way in which technology and other things now like shorten the distance between the problems of home and the everyday of campus life, right, it fundamentally shapes how students move through, right? I'll give this quick example. I learned about a student, and his name was August, and he told me about how he no longer waits for text messages or Facebook posts or Instagram or Snapchat posts from family and friends to understand what's happening at home, because he downloaded the Citizen app. And in this app, a Citizen app like tells you, oh, there's a water main break on 3rd Street, or there's a fire on Percival Avenue. It kind of tells you where in the city to avoid because of traffic or whatever. But for him, it was almost like a social weather report of what was happening outside his door. Those are the different kinds of realities that students face as compared to the one you think about when you hear that a student goes to Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Amherst, where it's usually an image of bucolic hills, nice sidewalks to walk down, the local ice cream parlor, very middle class or upper middle class, or quite frankly, like wealthy neighborhoods that are protected and as some students say, dull and boring, but that were actually very much a buffer to the outside world. Those are the things that we have to deal with and understand, that when students come to college, they don't leave their communities behind. And it's not that lower income students in particular are running away from home. They are trying to get away from what makes home hard. Universities need to understand that as they go out and recruit students, and especially once those students get to campus.
And I like how your book shows how that challenge was really exposed because of the crisis surrounding COVID. How these institutions reacted to COVID really exposed the limits of what they were doing, and oftentimes the blindness of what they were doing. And I especially liked how you did that in the first section, where you describe how you don't just talk about one particular group of students. You describe you provide a sampling of these experiences, and how you demonstrate, and this is a truism, but it's still worth noting, how wealth really determined that nature of it. How for wealthy students, there was a support structure to fall back upon. There were opportunities there for them. COVID was an annoyance, it was a shrug, and for some of them it was an opportunity. But for lower income students, it was something very different in a way that their peers probably didn't appreciate.
Yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is, some people had options, and it wasn't about like, oh, where, what room will I work in, or what we'll be having for dinner. It's like, which house am I going to? What country will I visit with my COVID passport? I talk about a student who rented a castle with other friends, and they turned this, very old place into this hip, fun adventure during the pandemic. Where other people were, like many of the lower income students who were, scrambling for food. This one parent told her family that they had to adopt a vegetarian diet because meat was just too expensive to buy for everybody. And to the point that she even got mad when one of her kids ate 2 apples instead of 1. And the student who I talked to had to witness just how much stress the family was over an apple, right? Versus other students who are climbing out of Mercedes-Benz trucks in a foreign country because they want to see friends, so they rent the castle. That is literally the kind of wealth inequalities that we see, especially on campuses like Harvard. But not just Harvard, right? People think that all the money in higher education is at Harvard. Vanderbilt is very rich. Duke is very rich. Some of our publics house students who are exceedingly wealthy, like Michigan, right? And so there's a lot of inequality that is in higher education, but the destinations for students was directly shaped by social class. There were students who rented Airbnbs and Verbos and yes, castles, and they did it, and they chose different locations based upon the weather. There was one student who chose what cities she and her friends would travel to based upon who had the best beaches and waterfront locations. They curated an experience that went beyond just travel. Versus lower income students, those who had a home to go to, sometimes went back to very distressed and difficult situations that were made worse by the crippling economic collapse of their families. But there were also students, I have to say, who, quite frankly, knew that going home was downright dangerous. And they did everything in their power to try to avoid home.
And that's something that...
And they struggled to do so.
Yeah, I was thinking how that comes when you describe, and it was something I didn't really fully appreciate. And I apologize if this is a little glib, but when I was reading about some of those experiences, it made me think about in how in Harry Potter would spend the holidays on the school, because that was basically he didn't want to go home. Home was not a very pleasant place, and it being on campus, being there for that was secure, and how that's something that students might have opportunities for in colleges and universities in America. But you have this event in which you had administrations that were saying, sometimes with regret, we're going to have to kick you off. That you can't stay here because of this pandemic. And so it wasn't that they were basically saying, well, I'm bored, I guess I have to go back home. They were being thrust back into these systems, and at the same time they were also expected to stay connected to the campuses and do classes virtually.
I mean, students likened it to an eviction notice, and it wasn't the first time that many of them have ever faced eviction. And also as one student, Dawn, told me, the difference between what happened in COVID and what happened other times that campus closed is that she was able to mentally and emotionally prepare for returning home. She knew that going home was a closeted existence. She was afraid to go outside when she was home. But and for a host of reasons, like many students and many people in general take walking down the street in their neighborhood for granted, right? It's what they do in the morning, it's what they do to close out their day. But for many students, especially students who come from places that have never sent students to the Ivy League or those small selective liberal arts colleges, they know that it's best not to be caught outside after the street lights come on. So there were a lot of external things. And I think higher education in general doesn't pay, and that means the scholars, the administrations, the universities, don't really pay enough attention to structural inequality, especially place-based inequalities. We don't pay enough attention to segregation and the consequences of it, especially on the lives of children, who we then welcome as full-grown students into our universities. But yeah, it's a very dangerous game sometimes that students have to play when it comes to engaging with their neighborhoods.
One of the things I liked most in terms of that study was how it is, you described it, is very much defined by wealth. And when you think about how many administrators don't come from that background. It's not that they're not necessarily unsympathetic. They just don't appreciate what that experience must be like for them. They might be middle income, or they might be upper income. They might be second, third generation people who have not just gone to college, but had lived in academia, and how they just don't realize the impact that could have. How could they? You do recommend some ways in which colleges and universities could address the situation. What are some of those steps in terms of making campuses more supportive in terms of this particular issue with it?
Yeah, and I want to say, and I'm glad that you bring it up, about the class inequality that exists not just in the student body, but in the faculty and administrators, right? So people with PhDs are 12 to 25 times more likely to have a parent who also have a PhD, right? When we think about hereditary positions, like being a doctor, especially like being a veterinarian, like professors are family occupations as well. And so a lot of people who do end up in administrative roles or who run universities or run colleges actually don't come from backgrounds that will give them insight into what many of their students are dealing with. The thing is, higher education caters towards the middle class in a myriad ways. So it is inspiring for me sometimes, it's inspiring for me, period, to see a first-gen president or a president who comes from a non-traditional background, a president even like I remember Betty Martin, who came from a rural background, to come into different high-level roles at different institutions of higher education, because we need that perspective. We need that understanding that could be that can lead to and then influence policy, because it's not because we don't pay enough attention to rural poverty, for example, in both the scholarship and in the research. We need a better understanding, because if we did have a much more nuanced understanding of what students go through, that could inform our mental health practices, right? We could actually develop not just a more robust staff, but actually a robust curriculum for them. Do we understand, like, for example, every therapist who's worked their way knows how to help a student through divorce of parents or death of grandparents, because those are modal life events for 18 to 21-year-old college students. A lot of students, because of life course, right? But when it comes to understanding place-based inequality, we do a disservice to our lower income students, our rural students, and our native students, because therapists genuinely don't understand the kind of hurdles that those students face in college. The calls that they get, the students who get the calls about, who are dealing with the opioid epidemic, who are dealing with drug use, who are dealing with gun violence that has ripped through, different parts of rural America and other parts of the country, that these middle-class suburbs don't experience, or at least don't publicly experience, because they get access to these therapists and these get clean clinics in a different sort of way. But we actually need to prepare ourselves, not because we're being prescriptive and saying every student is going to deal with it, but when we look at the exposure that these students have had to some of the most savage inequities that our country has seen, right? We need to be able to make sure that we can have a conversation with them and have things and support to help them as they deal with the pressures of home and the new responsibilities of college.
I think that there was something in the second section of your book where you talk about finance and work that I thought really illustrated that for me. You don't make the point, you don't make it the centerpiece of it, but when you have a chapter where you describe paid labor on campus and how COVID impacted it. And you describe how some students were told that, that their jobs effectively were no longer there because their work wasn't needed for the time being. Others had a support structure. Basically, they were like, we're going to find a way to keep paying you. We're going to find a way to keep you working. And as I was reading it, I was realizing the jobs that the students were doing where they're being told that, we don't have work for you anymore, we're going to have to let you go for the time being, those generally tend to be more working class oriented jobs, your janitors, your food service workers, whereas the ones where the colleges really seem to make an effort to keep the jobs going tend to be the more middle class ones, the research assistants, yes, the docents at the art museum or something like that, and how it was like administrators seem to appreciate the need to perpetuate work, but they only really trying to tackle it or understand it from the standpoint of the kind of work that white collar, middle, upper class people would do.
Yeah, you're spot on. The fact of the matter, I said, like, many students said that it wasn't that COVID was not just an eviction from campus, right? It wasn't just like getting an eviction letter. It was also like getting a pink slip. And for those who may not remember, but when people used to get terminated, they used to get like these triplicate forms saying you've been terminated, and you would get the pink copy of it. And so I titled that chapter "Pink Slips," to bring back that imagery, right? The fact of the matter is, what I reveal in the book is that there has always been a class segregated labor market on campus. Middle-class students were disproportionately more likely to be in life of the mind positions. Like, as you mentioned, those jobs that, are course assistants, where you're a teaching fellow or you're doing a research job with a faculty member, right? And these jobs pay, there are some jobs that pay wages for hours work, but some jobs give you additional forms of capital, like faculty support, recommendation letters, vouching for you when you're in your room. Middle-class students were disproportionately in those positions. Lower income students, oftentimes because the research jobs, one, there was no clear application. Two, you had to be comfortable schmoozing with a faculty member to get those jobs. And three, you had to kind of already know people or know where to be or be in places that were gate kept by other faculty members to even get those positions. Some lower income students were disproportionately in like janitorial, custodial, food service, like barista jobs. And what I use this work to show is that, hey, when COVID came, it didn't just expose this class segregated system that you have allowed to exist for generations, but the inequality actually grew because working class students who were in, like, as you would say, working class jobs, but I say like work for pay jobs, lost all of their hours just about. Whereas middle class students who were working these research jobs and teaching jobs, their hours actually increased during the pandemic because their services were needed more. So in other words, the students who needed less, at least financially, were given more support, more hours, more money, because their bosses, who were administrators and faculty members, said, hey, I need you on my team. Like, I can't handle the increase in office hours. I need you to do this online research for me. Versus lower income students, disproportionately, who were in these work for hire positions or these one day off, like, these one day off jobs, they lost their hours. So the students who needed more financially were given less support, fewer hours, and they had to grapple with insecurity because they would send money home. They were taking on additional burdens, whereas in middle class peers, as one student told me, she was like, I work for shits and giggles. Mm-hmm. Another student told me, I work so that I can try out all the Indian restaurants in Cambridge. Like, that's a very different reality. One student talks about being a connoisseur of Indian restaurants in the greater Boston area. And another student tells me that he worked to, quote, erase that uncertainty, end quote, that his family faces to keep the fridge, if not full, at least not empty.
I think sometimes we tend to forget how packed with crises and events and not to be too glib about drama that 2020 was, and it's interesting how you have this event that you've been chronicling in the book about COVID and its impact upon students, and yet you then also talk about how and sometimes it's easy to forget how it was happening simultaneously. We had the death of George Floyd. We had the protests surrounding that, and how we see another aspect of this inequality, that emerges from this. And I like how what you present in the book is how, so for so many people, they treat college as a place to meet new people and oftentimes people from very different backgrounds, and how you have this encounter, and how, especially for people who are poorer, who are persons of color, who come from more impoverished backgrounds, how oftentimes they are almost, I wouldn't quite say on display, but they have their wealthier peers sort of putting expectations upon them about how either it's you're my point of reference, or I expect you to educate me about this, and which is not why they're there.
Yeah, A college is a very interesting microcosm, right? It is a place of extreme diversity and extreme sameness. Extreme sameness in the sense is that generally, especially on a residential campus like Harvard, where I did the study, and like Amherst, where I attended, everyone is like between 17 and 22 years old. Everyone is highly motivated. Everyone is like credentialed up the wazoo. But everybody is also, this is the only place that you will see as much diversity in the rest of your life. Like no other place has has many people from as many countries, as many class backgrounds, as many, X, Y, and whatever dimension you want, you probably won't see as many people from those places that you do in college.
And if I may,
the fact that I'm not,
you emphasize how in this earlier in the book about how this is something that has been consciously constructed by administrators, that this has been something they've been striving for decades.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong, as I also talk about in the book, the case against Harvard, what Students for Fair Admissions against Harvard is making universities take new approaches to try to achieve this diversity, but it definitely shackles them from being able to be as efficient and as good at their job as they once were, even though there was still a lot of work left to do. But in bringing so many people together, you also bring a lot of biases and lack of understanding about who's now sitting next to you. And there were certain students who did not know how to process what was happening in the country around George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and the many people who were killed who made the public news, but then also the silent losses that we experience with the number of, Two-Spirit and Two-Spirit and women of indigenous backgrounds who we lost during the same period of time and for a long and before that. And there were white students who would call up their friends and say, "Hey, how are you doing?" And to some, that was a great thing. It was like, okay, you're showing empathy. You're showing that you understand what's going on. The problem is those same students who made the calls were the students who made that Black friend or that Latino friend or that Native friend feel uncomfortable and downright unsafe on campus before all of this happened. They were the ones who would walk up to you after 3 times of meeting you and you would tell them your name. And as one young woman told me, that a white friend was like, "Can I just call you Maria? I just want to call you Maria." Like just no context, no nothing. Like that wasn't her name. I just want to call you Maria. Or the same person who, would threaten you who would threaten to call the school officials on you when you were too loud in the cafeteria is now calling you, see how you were doing. Or for those members of sports teams, when you're the only Black face on these, country club sports teams like tennis and equestrian and all these other sports and squash, when everyone looked to you to not only teach them about race, but be the public face of the group on Instagram and social media, other social media outlets to say, "Hey, this group isn't racist and we care." And yet this was the same person who told you, as one young woman told me, they don't want to go to quote unquote Black parties because those things are too aggressive for her. After asking her repeatedly, "Why do you say hi to too many Black people?" Right? It's like you can ignore your own transgressions that are happening on campus, even as you focus on the travesties that happen off campus. How are students of color supposed to feel comfortable when you walk up to a Native student and say, "Hey, do y'all still live in teepees?" one moment. But then when you hear a story about a Two-Spirit person being killed, you call that friend and say, "Hey, how are you doing? I heard about this."
We appreciate the time for taking to speak with us. But before we go, could you tell us what you're working on now?
Yeah, my student just had a baby, so I'm knitting a baby blanket for them as a surprise.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really happy for them. And so they picked the color and I picked the design. So I just started working on it. I had to learn how to do a double decrease. And so that's something that was new to me. I'm looking forward to that. And otherwise, I am gearing up to share the book. And the last thing is that's really going to be like a bigger project is I recently started. I was recruited away from Harvard to Boston University, and I am the director of the Newbury Center. We have expanded twice over. We expanded our staff and we expanded our space. So I very much look forward to this year being a time of kind of like being that potted plant that's getting repotted and like to a bigger space and building out the programming and the practices that we are going to do there.
Well, congratulations on your new opportunity. I wish you the best with it. And I wish you the best with this book as well. I hope it gets a wide audience.
Thank you.
Tony, thank you very much for your time, taking some time out of your schedule to speak with us. I hope you have a wonderful day.
You too.